Right, now we've done some EQ, noise gating, and compression on our drums. We're going to take a little look at building in some creative effects for our drum sound. So we'll take a look at two approaches, one being an insert, the other one being a send and return using an aux. Now I've got my drum tracks here in a mix bus folder. So what I've done is I've taken my drum tracks and I've pushed Shift, Command, and D on the keyboard, and I get this pop-up. I selected summing stack, click create, and then all these tracks here you can see in the background are now in this drums summing stack mix bus folder. The output of each of my drum tracks has changed to bus 1. The input on this drum mix bus is input bus 1. So they're all being fed to this one master fader, which is great. I can do some mix bus mixing for my drums. I can put some reverb on this, some compression, some EQ, and then of course control the whole drum sound with a fader if I'm happy with the drum mix. But I just want to bring the whole level up or down, then I can do that with a summing stack. Folder stacks, same kind of thing, but it's just a basic track stack, as it says here, that just lets you mute, solo, and control the volume. With summing stack, you can do a whole lot more, which is what I'm going to put this in. I'll also do the same with my guitars, which are currently just in a folder. As you can see, I can mute it, solo it, but I can't pan it, put any effects in, or anything else like that. So I'm going to change that over in a bit as well as put my vocals into a mix bus later. So I got my drum sound here. Let's remind ourselves of how we're sounding so far. Great. And so I've got my drums mix bus here. I'm going to go for audio effects, and I'm going to go down to my reverbs. Now, I'm a big fan of the Space Designer, which is an impulse response reverb. There's a couple of different reverbs you can use here in Logic Pro. There's the Chromaverb, which just emulates different rooms that we've got on here. Decay, that's measured at note values, size, density, the dry and wet. It's got EQ, damping EQ here as well. So remember to, particularly if you're using reverbs for like a mix bus, or it's taking care of a lot of things, to EQ your creative effects. In fact, try to always do this, just because if you've got a reverb room chamber setup that that all your drums are going to, but you want to cut out maybe some of the low end so it's not so boomy, or just be aware that you can start to tailor the frequency response of your reverbs in your mix. If you're finding a lot of mud is coming from somewhere, could be down to your creative effects, your reverbs just building up a lot of low energy with those low frequencies that have a lot more energy than other frequencies. So it could be worth doing some low cuts on those. So be conscious of those. The other reverbs we have Enverb, which stands for envelope, so it's got some nice envelope shaping you can do with the reverb sound. Attack, decay, sustain, and release, so you can shape the volume envelope of how the reverb is sitting there in the mix and how it's behaving. I think there's some presets here you can play with. Not use that one too much. There's the Silververb, which has modulation, I believe. Yeah, it's got a modulation circuit in there. So if you want some warbly flavor, have a little play with this guy. Again, it's probably got a handful of presets, but my favorite by far is the Space Designer that comes with Logic Pro. It's an impulse response reverb. As you can see here, there's some transient right here. So what it does is impulse response, they rely on samples to trigger the reverb sound. Okay, that's what shapes it. So you can drop in samples of synthesizers or any sort of sample, or samples, impulse responses from churches and big halls, small spaces and rooms, to emulate those through this impulse response reverb. You want to know more about IR reverbs? Check them out, do a little bit of research on them. But you can drop in samples from what you got in your Logic Pro library, or any sort of sound that you want to, and drop it in, and it will give your reverb a little bit of flavor. So we've got the volume envelope here. So this obviously shapes how long our reverb is going to last based on the sample that we've got on the inside here. Attack, decay. There's our attack. There's our decay. So I think it's just the bookends of it, really. We've got pre-delay, which basically offsets whenever the reverb starts, right? So it's triggered by like a snare drum or a kick drum, and then it will wait until the reverb occurs. So it's delaying the reverb here. We've got the length of the reverb measured in seconds, an estimated size. Okay. Low frequency spread, high frequency spread, and then a crossover between those two. We've got the dry incoming and the wet as well. And we've also got an output EQ. So as I mentioned a minute ago about EQing your reverbs, if you find there's just a bit too much tubbiness in there, or you want it a little bit brighter, take away some of the mid-range, you can do that. You can EQ your reverb. It's going to be quite important when we do mix bus reverb here as well. And there's a ton of presets on these as well, which is great on the Space Designer. So this is probably one that I definitely recommend checking out. Okay, so let's have a look. We've put this plugin as an insert. Okay, we've inserted it into the channel strip, and I could do this with any one of my drums, of course. But what's great about a mix bus is I'm just going to use one reverb here to give it some overall drum ambience, okay? Just to tie the kit together a little bit. Then I might treat the snare drum differently in a bit. I might send that away to an aux and have its own snare reverb to help it sit slightly differently in the mix. So I'm just going to have a gentle room reverb here, okay? So let's search for something, maybe a medium space plate reverb. There's a drum plate, look at that. So plate reverbs are nice smooth sounding reverbs. They're used on drums and snare drums, on vocals. So it's a really nice beginning place to go. Now if I'm using my Space Designer here, a reverb as an insert, I'm going to want to have 100% dry signal, okay, all the way up, because without the dry signal, and if I just have some wet going on, I'm not going to have any of the original dry signal from my drums here at all. Okay, let's have a listen. Okay, so if I'm using a plugin as an insert here, I'm going to want to have the dry, particularly on a mix bus at least, okay, because it's going to be taking care of everything inside it. I want to make sure that I'm sending 100% of the dry signal to it. So let's just take out the wet for now. There it is. If I take the dry out, it's going to drop the entire level of the drums. Then I can start to blend in the wet amount. And again, I don't want to go too hard here with just like a nice ambience that's just going to tie the kit together a little bit, okay? And just give it a little bit of ambience in the mix. Okay, feel free to play with the parameters on your own reverbs as well and see how they respond. Okay, a big bit of advice is just to push and pull these knobs around until you can start to hear what they're really doing. Okay, rather than reading too much, understand the fundamentals and how they, the elementary rules behind them and what they're there for, but really rely on your ears a lot more, okay, than just than anything else. Okay, good. So just some room ambience there for our drum kit. Now what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to try a send and return on my snare top, which I think was this track here. So it's got a nice bit of ambience in the room. I want to send it away just to give it a nice big reverb that I can blend into the mix a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead for the sends lane right here. I'm going to drop down. I'm going to choose bus. Now, bus 1 has already been taken by this drums mix bus folder because, again, we've sent all of the drum tracks here, in our mix bus folder. They're outputting to bus 1 already, and they're going input on bus 1 here. So the next one available is bus 2. Now you can see in the mixer, I've got aux 2 that's just been set up over here. So it's got the input of bus 2, and I got this little dial right here on the track now. So I can start to increase this, and I'll push some over, and it'll end up into our aux 2 over here. So I'm going to rename this snare verb. Just going to use some shorthand with SN. Otherwise, like these other tracks here, it's going to take up too much real estate, and it's going to be a while until you figure out what's going on. So I've got a couple of options. I can go post pan, which comes basically with post pan and post fader. It includes your plugin list here, so anything that's going on. Okay, the difference between post pan and post fader is if we go post pan, if I pan my snare drum, it's gonna also pan it over here on the snare verb aux. But if I go post fader, it's going to go after the fader but before the pan pot. So I could have my snare panned, or anything panned, vocal or whatever, but on the aux over here, it's still going to come through on the center, which means that I could, if I wanted to, I could pan this over. So an example would be like if I had the snare drum, it could be dry on the left, but then I could have this snare reverb panned to the right hand side. I could be a bit creative with where I put the reverb. Same sort of thing with a vocal. If I was to take my lead vocal here, send this away to bus 3, which would be the next one, and I had this one as vocal verb, okay, and I take my vocal and I send it away post fader, but before the pan, I could have this vocal on the left and the reverb playing out here on the right hand side only. Okay, but if I was to go post pan, it would mean that if I was to pan this, it's also going to come through on either the left lane or the right hand lane. And then of course the last option is to send something pre-fader, which means that it's going to send it over before it's had any sort of processing on here at all. Okay, you might find reason for that. I can't think of an example right now. I'm sure there's plenty of examples where you'd want to send it over pre-processing. If you had maybe like a vocal on here that had a bit of delay on it, but you wanted to do something else to it on an aux channel, you'd want to send it pre-fader, so it doesn't bring over the delay that's with it. You're just sending over the dry vocal. Okay, just sending over the dry vocal, and then you can do a separate effects chain with some distortion on there without worrying about carrying over any of the plugins. So I'm going to choose to have this sent over post pan, because I'm not going to pan my snare drum. I'm just going to keep that right down the middle. And I want the effects on it as well. I want it to be noise gated. I want it to have the right EQ that we've set up in the compression, so it's nicely treated. So now, if I just hit play, you can see that the snare drum's going to come through now. Well, as soon as I push this this little pot up, it's going to come through my, snare verb over here. There it is. And you can see, if I pan it to the left, it's coming through left on the bus, and to the right, it's going over, because I've got it post pan. If it was post fader, it's still going to come right down the middle. So I can have my dry snare on the left, and I could have, at the moment this reverb's in the center when I put a reverb on it, but I could push it to the right as well, which can be quite an interesting thing to play with. So be aware of those 3 features, okay? Excuse me, so we're going to go pre-fader, post pan. So I can send over the snare drum processed. Now on the snare verb, let's go back to our space designer. Let's chuck on something quite large, okay, just for the sake of it here. Let's go outdoor spaces, maybe got a large room, long snare reverb. There we go. So now if it's being sent over, we're going to make sure that we're going to want 100% wet only. Okay, well I want to in this case, because I've got my dry signal over here anyway. Okay, so let's take this out. It's being sent over, isn't it? So I've already got my dry signal over here. I don't want to send any more dry signal over because it's just going to be increasing in volume, right? I just want this just to be a snare reverb channel. So I just want to have the wet, okay? So let's just have a listen to this wet reverb. I need to send it back over, don't I? Let's turn this off. There it is. There's my dry. And I can blend in this snare reverb. It's quite huge. Can change the volume envelope if I feel like it's going on a bit too long. And the EQ as well, let's take out some of the bottom end. There we go. Something kind of nice and bright here, okay? And that's not even that much being pushed in. So let's hear our drum sound with its ambience we had a second ago. And let's push up some of this snare reverb here on the send and return. Wonderful. And that's inserts versus send and returns. And you can use this in all sorts of situations with vocals and anything else. So here's our lead vocal, right? It's unprocessed at the moment. Let's send this guy over to bus 3, our vocal reverb. Let's have a space designer back on here. Let's choose something appropriate for a vocal, just a medium space, medium plate, or a small reverb, small plate for vocal ambience. Let's have this guy on. Let's send it. Well, there's no processing, so it doesn't really matter at the moment, but we can still play with like the post pan thing. So if I send it post pan at the moment, let's send an amount over. Got 100% wet. I got the dry here already, so I don't want to have any extra dry going on. So if I pan my vocal, the reverb's going to follow it. But a creative thing you can do is if we have this post fader but pre-pan, I can have my dry vocal on the left. And of course you can still hear the reverb coming right down the middle, which means I can freely pan this reverb now to the right. Yeah, you're beautiful naturally. It'll be a beautiful effect there when you've got the reverb on the right. You can do the same things with like delays. Have a delay on the right hand side or a delay on the left hand side with the dry vocal maybe sitting in the middle, that kind of thing. Have the freedom to push and pull things around when you play with post pan and post fader. All right, that wraps that one up there. And then we'll move on to something else afterwards, probably some vocal mixing. We'll get to this whole session eventually, okay? So there we go. That's inserts versus send and returns, and also the difference covered in this video of post-pan, post-fader, and pre-fader, which can give you lots of options with the send and returns of where you want to put those effects, okay? Really experiment with those things. They're wonderful things to get into. And I'll leave this whole session as is, even with the vocal untreated. I'm just going to leave those tracks up here so you can have a play with those, okay? Let's have a listen to those drums once more. Yeah, great stuff. Okay, let's call it there.